Just like Breshad Perryman, another wide receiver that I think has seen his draft stock increase quite a bit as the draft process is went along. Not quite to the same meteoric level of a Breshad Perryman, but certainly a rise nonetheless, is Nelson Agholor from USC. Now, here's a guy that when I watch him on film, there are things that I really, really like about him. To me, I think he's one of the most fluid and smooth of all the wide receiver prospects in this year's draft. A lot of what you could say about Nelson Agholor's game is about its smoothness, its crispness, its fluidity. Here's a guy that's good in and out of his breaks, that I think does a good job coming in and out of his breaks on his routes as well. A smooth route runner, just a fluid athlete and a fluid player. A guy with good quickness, not great quickness, but good quickness. Good speed, not great speed, but good speed. Pretty good, solid, somewhat consistent hands. A guy that seemed to be able to make some big plays at some big times for Cody Kessler in that USC offense. Here's a guy that kind of had to wait in the wings a little bit the past couple of years behind first Robert Woods and Marquise Lee, and then just Marquise Lee. And then 2014 was kind of his time to be showcased, and he was showcased relatively well. Here's a guy with decent size. I mean, he's not somebody that's going to be 6'5", but a guy that's big enough to play outside at the NFL level, and a guy that I most certainly think can stick outside at the NFL level, but also has the ability to run the type of routes because of his fluidity, because of his smoothness, because of his crispness, because of his solid route running, to be able to be a weapon out of the slot as well. A guy that you can deploy and line up all over the place. I look at a guy like Nelson Agholor and I say, I see why some teams really like this guy. I see why more NFL draft media members are starting to get on board with him. I see why now I'm starting to see him go from being a third-round pick to a second-round pick to now some people are talking about him going as soon as Philadelphia at number 20. I get it and I understand it because in the right system, a system like Philadelphia, here's a guy that can work well in open space. Here's a guy that would be able to consistently get open. Here's a guy that you could count on. He's not going to be the most physical guy in the world. He's not going to make the most spectacular plays, but he's going to be a really solid, steady, kind of consistent hand. And there's a lot of appeal for that. I don't know if that equates necessarily to being a first-round pick, but a second-round pick most certainly. However, when it comes to Nelson Agholor, I have some major reservations and some major concerns. First is that in a draft class that, again, is really good at wide receiver, I don't know that he has any one special trait that really makes him stand out. And if I'm going to be taking a receiver that high, I want somebody that has a special trait that really stands out. And you might say, as smooth and fluid of an athlete as he is, that that's the special trait or characteristic that he has. Similar to like an Amari Cooper, not quite as good, but you get the idea. Well, I get that and I understand that, but Cooper's also a much better athlete in my mind than Nelson Agholor to go along with that smoothness. When I look at Agholor, I see a guy that's good but not great. That was pretty good at USC, but I never really viewed him as a star. Sometimes when you see a star, you just know it. And I've never really viewed Nelson Agholor as a star. I think he profiles in a lot of ways more as a number 2 wide receiver at the NFL level than a number 1 wide receiver at the NFL level. And again, if I'm drafting in the first round for a wide receiver, I want a guy that can become a number 1 wide receiver, not a number 2 wide receiver, because I can draft those number 2 wide receivers later on in the draft. I can find those guys in free agency, via trade, via what have you. You have to prioritize. Do you really view Nelson Agholor based off of his film as a number 1 type of prospect? And I'm just not completely sold on that. But my biggest reservation, honestly, we can sit there and talk about breaking down film, and I can talk about route running trees and this and that, what he does well, what he doesn't. But sometimes we overcomplicate this shit. I think the most simplistic concern that I have is that he's a USC wide receiver. And for some reason, that's not being talked about enough in this year's draft process when it comes to Nelson Agholor. And this is a concern. This is a serious and significant concern. Because not only on film does he not demonstrate to me real number 1 wide receiver type of capabilities, I also know that he comes from a program that has produced a lot of underwhelming, underproducing disappointments and if not flat out busts at the NFL level. Now, while sure, he's not the same type of physical profile of somebody like, let's say, a Dwayne Jarrett or a Mike Williams, he still comes from the same program. And I look at other big name wide receivers that came from USC over the past couple of years, like Robert Woods, somebody I was really high on in 2013, and Marquise Lee, a guy again that I was really high on in 2014. I don't view Nelson Agholor as good of a prospect as either one of those two guys coming out of college, and Lee, due to injuries and what have you, didn't produce that well at Jacksonville as a rookie, and Robert Woods, in part maybe because of quarterback play, but just in general, really hasn't produced all that well at the NFL level, most certainly not at the level of a number one wide receiver that I thought he could be coming out of college. So to me, if Nelson Agholor isn't as good of a prospect as Robert Woods, who was a second round pick, or Marquise Lee, who was a second round pick, why now are we talking about Nelson Agholor as a first round pick? Furthermore, again, we have to talk about the history of the position at that school. This is a program that for years has produced many disappointing, flat-out bust at wide receiver at the NFL level, guys that didn't live up to their lofty draft status. We talked about that for years with Michigan wide receivers and why you wanted to stay away from them. And this school's this position, and that school's that position. Why are we not talking about this more when it comes to Nelson Agholor being a USC wide receiver? I think this is a legitimate concern. This is a significant concern because maybe this school does something with their wide receivers where they feature them in a way that they only accentuate the positives and they completely hide the negatives. And we're talking about USC. They throw a lot of dink and dunks, a lot of screens, a lot of quick flare-outs, the type of things that you don't have to be the most skilled in order to look good. Their system tends to elevate the draft status of their wide receivers to a degree. And again, I don't think he's as explosive an athlete as Marquise Lee, and I don't think he was even as explosive an athlete as a Robert Woods. When you're talking about a Nelson Agholor, I see somebody that is more of a number 2 wide receiver at the NFL level than a number 1. And I don't think he was as good of a prospect as Robert Woods or most certainly Marquise Lee coming out of USC. So I don't understand how both of those guys were second-round picks, but now we're talking about Nelson Agholor as a first-round pick. And again, when you throw in the fact that he comes from USC, has a long lineage of disappointing receivers at the NFL level, I think spending a first-round pick on Nelson Agholor is foolish. There are safer options. There are better, more explosive options based off of the film, based off of the programs they come from than a guy like Nelson Agholor. Now, if you're talking about taking this guy in the middle to late portions of round 2 or early round 3, that's fine. That's about where I grade him as a prospect. I think that's where he belongs in this draft. I don't quite see where people are getting first-round talent when they look at him. I just don't see it. Now, you can feel free to let me know where I'm wrong, but I don't really feel like in this particular case I am. I think Nelson Agholor will be a solid pro, will be a good pro, but I don't think he'll be a spectacular pro. And I think if a team takes him in the first round, like the Eagles or somebody else, even though he might be best positioned for success in a system like what Philadelphia runs with Chip Kelly, they might be always looking back and saying, man, we could have just taken another guy a couple rounds later and gotten the same production to use that pick somewhere else.